Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Real Gold. In this episode we're going to be going over camera settings, frame rate, shutter speed, ISO, also like aperture and auto settings. Not that you should ever use that shit. So yeah, let's get into it. Boys. So the first thing I'm going to be going over is frame rate. I've got a little setup just behind me, bit of Inception. I've got a red Komodo shooting a red helium. Basically, I'm just going to go over some settings so you can see from a more visual basis. Frame rate, what is it? Well, I'm glad you potentially asked. It's essentially the amount of frames per second that you're shooting in. Typically, if you're in the US, it'll be 24. UK and Europe and that, it's 25. So what that means is every second you're shooting 25 or 24 images in that second, and that are string together to create a sequence of images that are moving like you're seeing now. That's a frame rate. So I'm not going to go into like a ton of detail in terms of putting the footage into your editing software and how you can manipulate it and frame blending and all that sort of stuff. You need to stick to your frame rate for the majority of your footage. So everything you see here is 25 frames a second, and it's very unlikely I'm going to shoot 24 or 30. There'll be issues, there'll be drop frames and the footage won't look quite right. So the key is to keep it consistent. The only time I'd recommend switching up your frame rate would be if you're shooting B-roll. So you can do this at 50 frames a second, 60 frames a second, 120 frames a second, 300 frames a second. Take your pick, depending on your camera and your budget. Will depend on how many frames your camera goes up to. It's in the book, so I'm gonna have to do it. By the way, I've been told that I need to plug the book a little bit more because that's what this series is about. So, Tom, cue footage of Joe's Real Gold.
So I put everything you need to know about getting your videos to perform into this book. And I'll deliver a hard copy to your door for free. You just pay for the shipping. Rather than putting it on Amazon and getting a publisher involved, I thought it would be better for everyone if I put it out for free and charge just a few dollars to send it to your door. All you do is click the button below, tell me where to send your copy, and it's on its way. So, depending on what kind of frame rate you shot in, 25 frames. I'm gonna go 25 frames because I'm in the UK. I know my fan base is pretty worldwide. Mr. Universal, they call me. Or was that Pitbull? For the sake of this video, and because it's easier for me to remember, I'm shooting in 25 frames, which means if you are taking it into your project in your editing software, you're gonna need to stick it in a 25 frames a second timeline. If you don't, there'll be all sorts of hurt in the post. And trust me, we've done it here before on a number of occasions, Tom. Okay, so just make sure your frame rate that you're shooting in matches your project frame rate. There are exceptions to this, that would be B-roll again. So the whole method of slowing down your footage if you're shooting a high frame rate, like we stick to 50 frames. So if you're shooting 50 frames a second, you're gonna import that into your editing software in a 25 frames a second timeline, and it automatically drop every other frame. So the way to do it is to half the speed of your clip, and boom, you got some slow-mo. Okay, so I've got my setup here. Komodo filming the red. The reason I'm filming the helium is because the screen has all the information displayed on it really well. Simple to use. Also, there's a lot more frame rates, so I can give a better demonstration of how that's gonna look. Tom, jump to the Komodo. Now, one thing you have to remember, and this is critical, is you need to keep your shutter speed exactly double what your frame rate is. So 25 frames a second, you're shooting at 1/50 on your shutter speed. It's the same if you're shooting 50 frames a second, get a bit of slow-mo, you need to make sure you're double shutter speed so you're not getting any phase or any issues with frame rate and that. So now what I'm going to show you here is with 25 frames a second, it's more natural to what we see with our eyes. So you can see there's a nice bit of motion blur in there. But if I switch to
50 frames a second, and you're gonna see there's a lot more, because the shutter speed is higher, there's a lot less motion blur, but it's capturing a lot more frames a second, so it's a lot sharper. But also, because it's slow-mo, you can slow it down in post. You can always add like frame blending or motion blur in post if you want it to look a little bit less clean, but still buttery smooth slow-mo. Okay, 25 frames a second. Now, looks good, nice bit of motion blur. If, however, your shutter speed is off, for example, you're shooting, it doesn't look right, that's gonna really affect your footage in post. There's a lot more, well, there's a lot less motion blur, it just doesn't look right. You see how my fingers look a bit. Also, when you're shooting slow-mo or higher frame rates, obviously you're having to double your shutter speed. Now, one thing that people might not know is when you up your shutter speed, you're affecting the amount of light that's coming in. So your footage is going to be darker, so you're going to need to compensate with either your ISO, which we'll get onto in a minute, here, or your aperture, just so everything looks fine. Make sure if you're shooting higher frame rate, higher shutter speed, that you're correctly exposing with ISO or your aperture, and just bear that in mind when you're planning B-roll. If you're shooting something in low light, you're gonna have to bear that in mind. Oh, I could have made a bear that in mind joke. Tom, just shoehorn this in. Just bear that in mind. We've already done that one, but f it. Okay, so being the absolute pro that I am, and the oracle of information, I have skipped the second point, which is shutter speed, and included it in the first one. Now, the reason I've done that is because I forgot that I had to break this down, but also they go hand in hand, so I might as well explain the two at the same time. So that was shutter speed as well as frames per second, frame rate. So I'm gonna move on to aperture. So what's aperture? Well, again, I'm glad you possibly asked. Aperture is the technical term for how much light is coming into your lens. So this lens here is a 2.8. This lens here is an f2. This one here is a 2.2. Yeah. So that is the available light which your lens can let in. So also called f-stop or t-stop on certain lenses. You know, the thing is, I've already covered quite a lot of this stuff in my previous videos, so you should probably go back and watch all of them. I'm not going to tell you where I've covered this particular piece, but that means you just have to go watch them all. But Tom, just really quickly, to save me having to reel anything off here, can you chuck up the bit about aperture from my last few videos? It just shows it a lot better than I can here. And also, I need to have some chicken and rice. So, cheers, mate.
What is aperture? It's a good question, Dan. Okay, so you see them blades. That's essentially how aperture is measured. It's normally in increments. They're called f-stops or t-stops on a cine lens, but they're slightly different. Essentially the same thing, just measured differently. So yeah, the lower the aperture, the brighter the lens. So this is an f2. It's actually pretty sharp, pretty bright. And at the moment it's fully closed, which is f16, so it's not letting a lot of light in. Open the bad boy all the way up, so you're getting f2 aperture, which means all the light that it can physically let in is being lit in by the aperture blades. That's the simplest way I can explain it.
Okay guys, so the next thing I'm going to talk about is white balance. Now, white balance is basically the temperature that you're seeing or picking up, so it's measured in Kelvin. So daylight is 5,550 or 5,560, depending on how far back you go with film. Not going to get into it. And it goes all the way down to like tungsten, which is 3,300. I think. Tom, Google that. So to give you a quick demonstration on white balance and how it affects your footage, I'm going to switch to Komodo. So at the moment, we are shooting in 5,600, so daylight, which is perfect because most of this is most of the light here is daylight. Apart from up here, we do have a bit of interference. So another thing to bear in mind is if you've got multiple light sources, like a daylight window or a tungsten light or it's dropped. Okay, so we're back in the room. A little mishap there. For some reason I wanted to be smart and hang the Canon from somewhere fancy. It's all about the angles. As I was saying, you want to be careful about different light sources because it's going to interfere how your camera picks up the light source temperature. But just to dumb it down a little bit and keep it simple, I am shooting 5600 here, which is daylight. And if I go down, all the way down, 1700 Kelvin. I don't really know what situation you'd ever be in this Kelvin or temperature, but you can see how it affects the image. Very cold, very blue. And on the other end of the spectrum, if I whack it up to, how far is it going? 10,000 Kelvin. You can see the difference here. Very orange. Not quite as extreme as the blue and the lower Kelvin, but it makes a massive difference. Now most cameras have auto white balance. So my tip is find something that's in the room which is white, has a lot of light coming onto it. Click the auto balance and boom, you're good to go. Again, this is going to be heavily affected by the other light sources. So yeah, that's a quick overview of white balance Kelvin. But one thing I highly recommend is that you always get the correct white balance before you start shooting. Now, mainly because most cameras, this will affect the footage, how the contrast is and color balance is. So you want to make sure you get it right on set. Although you have the capability to correct it in post, it will affect the color detail. Luckily with red cameras, if you're shooting an R3D red, you are basically capturing only metadata on the ISO and the white balance, so you can correct it in post with no damage to the raw footage. Beautiful feature. Very unlikely you guys are going to have it on your DSLRs or phones. So yeah, just white balance, son. Get it right. Next one, International Organization of Standardization. Standardization. Basically what this is in its purest version, it's artificial light which your sensor is letting in. So yeah, ISO. You've probably heard of it, and it is a lifesaver to a degree, but you just have to be very careful how it affects your image. So I'm back to the Komodo. As you can see here, the image is very dark, and that's because my aperture is right down. That's just for demonstration purposes. So I'm going to show you how ISO affects your image. Now if I want to bump it up, what this is essentially doing is allowing the sensor to soak up more light. Now it's on an artificial basis, so there's a lot of noise that's being introduced into the image. So just bear that in mind when you're shooting in a dark situation. Even if your aperture is wide open, you're still, when you're using your ISO, you're gonna introduce a lot of noise and artifacts. So again, at the opposite end of the spectrum, I'm wide open here. So as you can see, everything's blown out. You're gonna wanna stick your ISO down. Now, rule of thumb tends to be, and it is sensor dependent, so camera dependent, but if your ISO is around 640 to 800, that tends to be a sweet spot. And minimal interference with any noise and stuff. So you can kind of work around it on then. Obviously, it's very dependent on what you're shooting. If you're looking for a lot of depth of field, you're going to be wide open on your aperture. So you're going to want to turn down your ISO to match. But rule of thumb, 640, 800. Now that's not gospel. This is gospel. So I just want to clear up a little myth regarding ISO, and it's something you'll see all on the internet and probably sounds very similar to what I've just reeled off. So essentially, like, your ISO is telling your sensor how much light to output rather than absorbing more light, if that makes sense. So that's where the noise and artifacts are introduced. You're cranking up the output that your sensor is capable of, so you're not actually letting in any more light like you would with an aperture. And the most common mistake that people new to photography and video make is that they will crank up the ISO to balance out your image. You think you're exposing it correctly, but you're just adding in stuff you don't want in there. Okay, so the last thing I want to discuss today is auto settings. Now, in my personal opinion, I think you should probably shy away from using them. If you're trying to build up your experience and your knowledge and just get more familiar with cameras, then you should make sure you're using manual settings. So nail your shutter speed, your frame rate, your ISO, and your aperture. Because otherwise you're going to be stuck. Oh, shit. And we're back. Because otherwise you become reliant on these settings and you're never going to learn. So yeah, basically auto settings, sack them off, get to grips with your manual settings, and yeah, that's pretty much it. Okay guys, so I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I'm not going to lie, it's been a pretty quick and rushed one. I'd probably like to spend a bit more time on it, but there's so much information that you can go through when talking about camera settings, so I just wanted to make it as basic and clear as possible. So keep an eye out for the next episodes. We're going to be talking about, I don't know actually. This is probably a good time to plug the Viddyoze platform. So yeah, I highly recommend you check out Viddyoze. It's Viddyoze.com. So essentially what it is an online animation template platform. So you go online, you pick a template, you upload your image or your logo, and then you've got the ability to customize it. So you change your colors, your font, your text, change your soundtracks now if you want. And then you hit the big render button, it spits it out, and you've got some pretty hot animations. The good thing about this is you don't have to spend ages learning After Effects or trying to work out how to edit. Basically, we're saving you a ton of time and money and allowing you to hone your skills a little bit better on your camera. You're very much welcome. So yeah, guys, final sign off. I'd love it if you liked the video. Maybe leave a comment, subscribe, follow us on Instagram, maybe, Facebook. Anyway, thanks for watching, guys. Peace. Nah, how the f am I gonna get down from here? Tom, I'm ready to get down now. Tom, I'm ready to get down now. Tom.